Paul and Barnabas had just come back from a very busy time trekking all across Asia Minor and winning converts for the faith, which had ended in a trip to Jerusalem to sort out a dispute over circumcision. Now, with this debate sorted, the two missionaries headed back home to Antioch, where they continued where they'd left off, teaching the local church. After a while, Paul got the urge to set off on another grand journey to go and see how the churches they'd planted were doing, and Barnabas agreed with him. The two men would not make the journey together though. Barnabas wanted to take a disciple named John with them, but Paul disagreed, since this was the same John that had left them early on in their last missionary journey. The two men got into a very heated argument, and in the end both decided to go their separate ways. Barnabas set off to Cyprus once again, and of course took John with him. Paul chose a disciple named Silas, and set off through Syria in the direction of Lystra and Derbe. Now, while he was in Lystra, Paul came across a believer who really impressed him, a man named Timothy. He was well spoken about amongst the Lystra church. Paul wanted him to join him on his journey, and Timothy was actually really up for it. However, with the recent controversy over Jewish and non-Jewish believers, Timothy fell into a strange place, as his mother was Jewish, but his father was Greek. Now, given that there were going to be a lot of Jewish believers in the areas they were going, and there was still this kind of hot-button issue, Timothy was circumcised before they set off to visit the various churches in the area. The missionaries set off and visited several towns in the area of Galatia and Phrygia, feeling that they were prevented from preaching further in Asia Minor by the Holy Spirit itself. They ended up in Troas, and while they were there, Paul had a vision of a man from Macedonia. In Paul's vision, he saw a man from Macedonia who beckoned to him and asked him for help, which Paul thought must be God's guidance to take the mission to Macedonia. Paul and the gang set off by boat for a new adventure. After a few stops, they ended up in Philippi, and while there, they heard of a place of prayer that they could go to, and naturally they went to visit, and while there, would talk to those gathered all about their faith. Now, one lady that came to visit this place was called Lydia, who was a believer in God and intently listened to what Paul and company had to say, and eventually converted to the faith, as did all of her household. She invited Paul and company to stay with her, and the missionaries accepted her invite. With a new base of operations, the missionaries continued to visit the place of prayer to preach and talk about their faith to the people gathered there. This place brought many people of all manner of backgrounds and beliefs, and one day a slave began to harass Paul and the rest of the missionaries. This slave was possessed by a spirit who could tell fortunes, and was apparently a very good money earner for her master. When she saw the mission, she began to yell about them to those assembled, screaming, "These men are servants of the Most High God who are telling you the way to be saved." The servant would continue yelling these things every time the missionaries came to preach and teach, and it became very disruptive, and it really irritated Paul, who demanded that the spirit leave the slave in the name of Christ, and of course it did. However, her master, upon discovering that his fortune-telling, money-making spirit had been exorcised, got really annoyed and dragged both Paul and Silas into the marketplace before the authorities, and presented them on the charges of promoting anti-Roman practices and worshipping foreign gods. The magistrates ordered that they be flogged and thrown in prison. Paul and Silas were of course beaten and thrown in jail, and their feet put in stocks. However, while they were locked up, Paul and Silas sang songs and prayed, and all the other prisoners enjoyed all the free entertainment. Now, during one of their hymns, there was a great earthquake, so great that it opened all of the cell doors, and woke up the jailer, who, when he saw the doors all open, decided it was about time to kill himself. Paul told him that the prisoners were all still there, and, relieved, the jailer asked how one became saved, which naturally the men agreed to share. So grateful, the jailer then took them home to preach to his household, and converted to Christianity. He gave them a meal, and afterwards returned them to prison. The next day, officials came to release Paul and Silas, but Paul had got something to say. He was a Roman citizen, and he hadn't had a fair trial as one. When the magistrates heard of this, they were freaked out, and came to the two men and profusely apologised, but did ask them if they could keep it on the down low and leave town just in case the word of this got out. The two missionaries went back to Lydia's and decided it probably was time to move on, so they said their parting words and set off once more. So the journey continued, and eventually the group arrived in Thessalonica, where Paul went straight to the synagogues and started preaching with, as usual, mixed results. Some people believed the message and others did not, and felt threatened by these outsiders. The missionaries stopped at a believer's house known as Jason, but some who disagreed with the Jesus message rioted and stormed Jason's house, looking for Paul and his friends. When they didn't find them, they grabbed Jason and brought him before the officials there, claiming that he harboured individuals who were working against the Roman Empire. However, they couldn't prove this, and Jason was released with a bond, or, and I suppose more modern terms, was released on bail. The missionaries, having avoided another incident, left quietly at night until they arrived in Berea. In Berea, they had better results and the mission gained success with many Jewish converts, but some from Thessalonica got wind of where they'd gone to and came to Berea to stir up trouble. Silas and Timothy sent Paul off to Athens, while they stayed behind and said they would join him later on. Paul chilled out in Athens, that great Greek city, and found himself disturbed by the polytheistic themes that he found there. There were so many gods! He decided to go straight to the synagogues as usual and start preaching his message, but he also decided he was going to preach in the markets as well. This caught the eye of many philosophers and philosophy types who were always up for new ideas, and they invited him to a meeting to discuss this interesting new religion. And so Paul presented his case to the philosophers of Athens, and as usual, some of them wanted to know more, some of them thought his philosophy was a load of rubbish, and some of them definitely laughed at him, especially when he started to talk about the resurrection of the dead. From Athens, Paul set off to the city of Corinth, where he befriended a couple named Aquila and Priscilla, who were exiles from Rome after it had been decreed that all Jews should leave Rome. They got on very well because Paul was a tent maker before he was a missionary, and they were tent makers as well, and so he stayed and worked with them for a while, preaching in the local synagogue on the weekends. While Paul toiled away making tents, Silas and Timothy finally caught up with him and joined him. They continued preaching in synagogues, but they met with a lot of resistance, and Paul eventually got annoyed with some of the Jews who just kept giving him a hard time. It was at this point he decided that he should take his mission to non-Jewish people, or Gentiles. Paul went to these non-Jews who were believers in Judaism or associated with them, and in the process gained some converts, both Jew and Gentile alike. During this time, Paul received yet another vision where he was told to keep going with his mission. This spurred him on, and he spent at least a year and a half in Corinth teaching and preaching the message of Christianity. His message, of course, did not sit well with some, and some of the Jewish community dragged him before the proconsul, Gallio, claiming he was preaching things against their faith. Gallio, however, he couldn't care any less, and he told them as such. Now, this really irritated the Jews, who then took their synagogue leader and beat him in front of Gallio, who, in typical ancient leader style, didn't really care. Paul stayed in Corinth for a little bit longer, but again set off with his friends Priscilla and Aquila, but before he went, he shaved his head because of a promise he had made, a promise which isn't actually recorded in the book of Acts. The now shiny bald Paul and his crew sailed off and ended up in Ephesus, where he left his friends Priscilla and Aquila, preaching again in synagogues. When they asked him to stay, he said he could not, stating that if God had meant it to be, he would be back. Soon off, he set off to Caesarea, and with a stop-off in Jerusalem, he headed back to Antioch. This ends Paul's second missionary journey. Join me next time for Paul's third and final journey, and the end of the narrative part of the Bible. The best way to follow his journey, of course, is to subscribe to the channel, but until next time, go grab a drink and keep asking questions.